Good afternoon, guys. In this chapter, I want to talk about the gross and microscopic anatomy of the respiratory system. This picture shows you the mid-sagittal section of the nasal cavity. Air enters the nasal cavity through the nostril or external nerves. The nasal cavity itself is divided into different parts. The entrance of the nasal cavity is called nasal vestibule. The majority of the nasal cavity is called the respiratory region, and the superior part of the cavity is called olfactory region, which can detect the sense of smell. Inside the nasal cavity, we have some bony projections in the lateral wall. These bony projections are called nasal conchi. In this picture, you can see the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchi. Between these nasal conchi, we have some tiny tunnels, which we call them nasal meatus. We have superior, middle, and inferior nasal meatus. The superior and the middle nasal conchi are the part of our Etchmoid bone, and the inferior nasal conchi is the separate bone. Our nasal cavity has a roof which is composed of the nasal bone, frontal bone with its frontal sinus, Etchmoid bone, and the sphenoid bone with the sphenoid sinus. And the end of our nasal cavity is called posterior nasal aperture, choana, this region, or internal nerves. In this part, you can see the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is the first part of our pharynx. The nasopharynx has the pharyngeal tonsil, which can trap airborne pathogens. You can see the opening of auditory tube or eustachian tube here, which is located between nasopharynx and middle ear cavity, and this tube can equalize the pressure of air on both sides of tympanic membrane. This tube is blocked when the plane wants to take off. When we have a sudden change in the pressure of the atmosphere, we have blockage of this tube. The best way for prevention of blockage is chewing something like gum. And for the newborn, it's better to use pacifier for them. And in the anterior and inferior part of the nasopharynx, you can see soft palate. The end of soft palate is the finger-like projection, which we call it uvula or uvula. In this skull, you can see the posterior nasal aperture or choana. These two foramen. In this picture, you can see the nasal septum. The nasal septum is made up of two bones and one cartilage. You can see the hyaline cartilage, which is the septal cartilage in the anterior region. In the superior part, you have perpendicular plate of ethmoid, and the inferior part is made up of the triangle-shaped bone, which we call it vomer. In this model, we removed all of the soft tissue, and you can only see the bones. You can see the roof of the nasal cavity, the nasal bone, the frontal bone and frontal sinus. The ethmoid bone, this part of ethmoid bone is called cribriform plate, and you can see the crista galli here in the superior portion, and this bone is called sphenoid with the sphenoid sinus. You can see the superior and middle nasal conchi and inferior nasal conchi, which is the separate bone. And the floor of your nasal cavity is made up of the hard palate and soft palate, but in this picture you can only see the hard palate. You have the palatine process of maxilla and the horizontal plate of palatine bone here. This is the model of head and neck, and you can see the mid-sagittal section of the head. You have the nasal cavity, oral cavity. You can see the larynx, trachea, and esophagus. First, I want to talk about the nasal cavity. You have the external nare or nostril. Number 6 is called the vestibule or entrance of the nasal cavity. You have the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchi. The floor of nasal cavity, which is composed of the horizontal plate of palatine bone, number 8, and the palatine process of the maxilla. You can see the soft palate and uvula here. And you can see two sinuses. One of them is the frontal, and the other one is the sphenoid sinus. And you can see the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx starts from the posterior nasal aperture. You can see the pharyngeal tonsil and the soft palate and the uvula. The opening of auditory tube is visible in this picture. After that, we have oropharynx. Oropharynx starts from uvula to the base of our hyoid bone. This region is called oropharynx. In the oropharynx, you can see the palatine tonsil and the lingual tonsil. And after that, you can see number 11, which is the laryngopharynx. In this picture, you can see some parts of the larynx or voice box. You have the spoon-shaped epiglottis. You can see cricoid cartilage, thyroid cartilage, and laryngeal prominence. And you can see trachea. The esophagus is located in the back of trachea. So in the neck, the trachea is anterior and the esophagus is located posterior. Here we made a sagittal section in the larynx. I want to show you the epiglottis, the thyroid cartilage and laryngeal prominence, the cricoid cartilage on both sides. This is a ring-shaped cartilage. All of the cartilages which I introduced to you are hyaline cartilage, except the epiglottis, which is the elastic cartilage. In this picture, you can see the vocal cords. The first one, number 5, is called false vocal cord or vestibular fold. It's not responsible for making sound. It can only close the opening of trachea when we want to swallow something. And number 4 is called true vocal cord or vocal folds. It's responsible for making sound. This is the other model of the nose which we have in the lab. In this model, you can see the frontal and sphenoid sinus. You have the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchi. You can see the hard palate with the palatine process of maxilla and horizontal plate of palatine bone, soft palate and uvula at the end. Number 10 is the opening of auditory tube, and number 5 is the nostril or external nerves. In this model, you can see the olfactory nerves, which start from the olfactory region of the nasal cavity, past the cribriform foramen of the cribriform plate of the Etchmoid bone, and attach to the olfactory bulb of the brain. And they can bring the sense of a smell to the brain, and then we can sense it and identify the smell. In this picture, you can see the nasal septum. In the nasal septum, we have the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone in the superior part, the vomer in the inferior part, and the septal cartilage, which is located anterior. This is the other model of the nose in the lab. Again, you can see the frontal and sphenoid sinus, superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchi, external nares or nostril and vestibule, hard palate, soft palate, and uvula, and this is the opening of Eustachian tube. You can see the olfactory nerves which pass the cribriform foramen in this picture too. And again, the nasal septum, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, vomer, and the septal cartilage. In this model, you can see first the hyoid bone, the bone without any articulation with the other bones. You can see the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. You can see the thyroid gland and the trachea. In this picture, you can see right and left lung. Our right lung has 3 lobes. You can see number 7 and number 8 here. These 2 numbers, they are fissures which can make our right lung to 3 parts. Number 7 is called horizontal and number 8 is called oblique fissure. You can see the superior, middle, and inferior lobe of the right lung. On the other side, you can see number 11. Number 11 is the oblique fissure, which can divide our left lung to the superior and inferior lobe. In the left lung, you can see the impression, the indentation, which we call it cardiac notch. This is the part where the apex of our heart is located. And number 13 is the diaphragm. The diaphragm can divide our thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity, and this is the major muscle for respiration. During inhalation, it can come down and increase the cavity of our chest, and during exhalation, it relaxes and goes up, decrease the cavity, and we can send the air out. Here you can see the coronal section of the lungs. And in this picture, you can see the superior, middle, and inferior lobe of the right, superior and inferior lobe of the left lung. You can see the trachea. In the middle of the mediastinal cavity, the trachea bifurcates at the site of guana to 2 main bronchus. You can see the left main bronchus with number 2, and this is the right. After that, the main bronchus in the right side makes 3 lobar bronchus, and in the left side, it makes 2 lobar bronchus, because in the right side, we have 3 lobes. In the left side, we only have 2 lobes. And after that, the lobar bronchus makes many branches, which we call them segmental bronchi. In this picture, you can see the diaphragm too. Here you can see the bronchial tree. In the bronchial tree, we have the trachea, which bifurcates to right and left main bronchus. And now I continue for the left side. We have 2 lobar bronchus in the left side and 3 in the right side. And after that, we have segmental bronchus. In the bronchus, we have hyaline cartilage, which are these blue structures. We reach a part where we don't have any hyaline cartilage. And when we are done with the hyaline cartilages, it means that our bronchus is finished. And from here, we have bronchioles. First, we have terminal bronchiole, Then we have respiratory bronchiole, alveolar duct, alveolar sac, and alveoli. And I will talk about these structures more for you in the lecture. Here you can see internal view of the left lung. It's left lung because you can see superior and inferior lobe. You have some cross sections here. Pay attention. The blue one represents pulmonary artery because the pulmonary artery carries the oxygenated blood. The red one is the pulmonary vein because it carries oxygenated blood. And the light blue are the segmental bronchus. They are the airways. In the lungs, we have three surfaces. One surface is toward mediastinum. We call it mediastinal surface. This is diaphragm, and one surface attached to diaphragm. We call it diaphragmatic surface. And the other surface is in contact with our ribs and intercostal muscles, and we call them costal surface. So you can see costal surface for right and left lung in this picture. Here you can see the model of larynx, the lateral and the anterior view. In this larynx, you can see first the hyoid bone. It's not a part of larynx. You can see the thyroid cartilage, laryngeal prominence or Adam's apple. This is the thyroid gland, and you can see the trachea here. Pay attention. In the larynx, we have many intrinsic and extrinsic ligaments, and intrinsic and extrinsic muscles, which you don't need to know about them. Here you can see the hyoid bone, thyroid cartilage, laryngeal prominence, and you can see the thyroid gland and the trachea. In the posterior view of the larynx, you can see a part of hyoid bone, the spoon-shaped epiglottis, which is the elastic cartilage. It can close the opening of larynx when we want to swallow something, and when we want to inhale, it comes up again. This is the characteristic of elastic fibers to become flexible and go back to their original position after stretching. You can see the thyroid cartilage here, the cricoid cartilage, the thyroid gland, and this is the trachea. In the trachea, we have C-shaped cartilage. Our cartilages in the trachea doesn't fully encircle the tube. And in the back of the trachea, we have muscle instead of cartilage, which we call it trachealis muscle. And this is the location where our esophagus is located. And when we want to swallow, this muscle can let the esophagus to become expanded. Here is the lateral view. You can see the spoon-shaped epiglottis, hyoid bone, laryngeal prominence of thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and trachea. And this is the thyroid gland. The mid-sagittal section of the larynx, you can see the hyoid bone. You have the epiglottis, the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, and the trachea and thyroid gland. In this picture, you can see the false vocal cord or vestibular fold and true vocal cord or vocal fold. The slit between them is called glottis. This is the glottis, the slit which we have between right and left vocal cords. You have the superior view of the larynx here. You can see the hyoid bone, the epiglottis, the glottis, the slit which we have between right and left vocal folds. And again, the anterior and lateral view of the larynx. You can see the hyoid bone, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, thyroid gland, and the trachea. The posterior view and mid-sagittal view, you can see the epiglottis here, and this is the thyroid cartilage. In this view, you can see the epiglottis, false and true vocal folds, the thyroid cartilage, and laryngeal prominence, and the cricoid cartilage. And this is the trachea. In the back of trachea, we have esophagus. Here you can see the real cadaver. You have the nares or nostril, the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchi, and this region is called posterior nasal aperture. You can see the auditory tube, the opening of auditory tube here. You have the hard palate, which is composed of palatine process of maxilla and horizontal plate of palatine bone, soft palate, and uvula. These brackets show you the different regions of the pharynx. The first region is nasopharynx up to uvula. Then from the uvula to the hyoid bone, we have oropharynx, and the last part is called laryngopharynx. You can see the epiglottis. You have the vestibular fold and vocal fold, or false vocal cord and true vocal cord. This is trachea. In the back of trachea, we have esophagus. Here you can see the larynx. This is the epiglottis, the hyoid bone, thyroid cartilage, and laryngeal prominence. And you can see the trachea and esophagus here. And when we remove the extrinsic muscles, you can see the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, and the trachea. And in the back, we have esophagus. And the epiglottis is the spoon-shaped cartilage which you have here. Epiglottis, hyoid bone. This is the thyroid cartilage and laryngeal prominence, cricoid cartilage, and trachea. Here you can see the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is this red cavity. In the thoracic cavity, we have two pleural cavities. They are the location of right and left lung. And between the pleural cavities, we have mediastinal cavity. In the inferior part of mediastinal cavity, you have pericardial cavity, which is the location of the heart. So these are the different cavities which we have in our chest. You can see the visceral pleura attached to the surface of the lung, and parietal pleura, which is number 1. Between visceral and parietal, we have pleural cavity, and in this cavity, we have a small amount of liquor pleurae, which prevent friction between these two layers of pleura. You can see the superior, middle, and inferior lobe of right side, and you can see the horizontal and oblique fissure. In the left lung, again, you can see the superior and inferior lobe, and the oblique fissure. And you have number 8 here, which is the parietal pleura for the left side. You see that in the mediastinum, you have your ascending aorta, aortic arch, and the branches. You can see the right and left brachiocephalic vein and superior vena cava. We have thymus in this region too. And number 7 is the diaphragm. We made a coronal section for our lung. You can see the trachea, the right and left main bronchus. Then you have lobar bronchus and segmental bronchus. You can see the superior, middle, and inferior lobe. You can see the horizontal and oblique fissure, superior and inferior lobe, and oblique fissure of left lung. And this is the diaphragm. Before I talk about this picture, I want to show you the diagram of the sheep lung. The sheep is a quadruped animal. And in the quadruped animal, instead of superior or toward head, we use cranial. Instead of inferior or away from head, we use caudal. In the lung of the sheep, for the left side, we use cranial and caudal lobe. And for the right side, we use cranial, middle, and caudal lobe. And in the sheep lung, we have one extra lobe, which we call it accessory lobe. So the sheep has one extra lobe, then we compare it with the lung of human. Now in this picture, you can see the real freeze-dried sheep lung. You can see trachea. This is the left and this is the right side. In the left side, you have cranial and caudal lobe. In the right side, this is cranial, this is caudal, and the middle is not visible in this view. And this surface, which is in contact with the ribs and intercostal muscle, is called costal surface. This is the anterior view. You can see the trachea. We have the cranial, middle, and caudal of the right lung, cranial and caudal of the left lung, and number 5 is the accessory lobe. Here you can see the impression. This is the location of sheep heart, and we call it cardiac impression. This is the posterior view of sheep lung. In this posterior view, you can see the diaphragmatic surface, the surface which is adjacent to diaphragm. You can see the cranial, middle, and caudal lobe of the right, and cranial and caudal lobe of left lung. This is the accessory lobe, and here you can see a foramen in which the inferior vena cava can pass. Actually, in the sheep, instead of inferior vena cava, we use caudal vena cava. On the dorsal view of the sheep lung, you can see a groove, a depression. This groove is called dorsal groove between the lungs. This is the location of the esophagus, the azygous vein, the descending thoracic aorta, and some other structures. This is the left lung, and this is the right lung. This is the model of pulmonary lobule, the functional unit of our lung. In this model, you can see the blood vessels and some respiratory tract. This is the segmental bronchus, and you can see the hyaline cartilage in blue color here. When the segmental bronchus finish, You can see number 4, which is the bronchiole or bronchiole. You have number 2 as the pulmonary vein and number 3 as the pulmonary artery. Then number 5 represents alveolar duct, a duct which contains many bubbles on both sides. In the wall of these alveoli or air sacs, you can see many elastic fibers. These elastic fibers can give elasticity to the alveoli to become expanded and then recoil back at the time of inhalation and exhalation. Number 7 represents alveolar sac, a sac-like structure full of air sacs or alveoli. Number 6 is the wall of the alveoli, and you can see capillary bed in the wall of alveoli. We have extensive capillaries here. They are the site of exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. The oxygen can move to the blood vessels from the alveoli, and the carbon dioxide go to the alveoli from the capillaries. In this picture, number 7 is the visceral pleura. This is the other side of long lobule model. And in this side, again, you can see intrapulmonary bronchus. You can see the pulmonary vein, the branch of pulmonary artery, and the terminal bronchiole. You can see the alveolar duct, a duct full of alveoli. You can see the capillary network here and visceral pleura. Here is the microscopic view of the wall of our trachea. In this microscopic view, you can see tunica mucosa, which is composed of epithelium and lamina propria, areolar connective tissue beneath epithelium. You have tunica submucosa, which contains seromucous gland. This gland can make serous and mucus and release it to the surface of epithelium. And you can see the hyaline cartilage. You know that the hyaline cartilage or tracheal cartilage has chondrocytes in the round lacuna and chondroblasts in the oval-shaped lacuna, and the matrix of hyaline cartilage is glassy and hemogen. And the last layer in the wall of trachea is called adventitia, which is the connective tissue which connects the trachea to the neighboring structures like esophagus. Now I want to zoom in the epithelium. The epithelium of the trachea is pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells. You know the meaning of pseudostratified. In pseudostratified, we only have one layer of cells, but because the shape of the cells are different, the location of the nuclei and the level of the nuclei are different. So we can see different levels for the nuclei, and it resembles the stratified epithelium, but it's not actually stratified. So we call it pseudostratified. The majority of the cells are columnar, so we add columnar to the name of the epithelium. And they contain cilia, so we call it ciliated epithelium. You can see goblet cells. The goblet cells can secrete mucus on the surface, and this is the viscous fluid which can trap pathogens and foreign particles like dust and pollen. And then the cilia can sweep them toward our pharynx. This is the other slide of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. You can see pseudostratified. These are cilia, and here is the goblet cell, mucus producing cell. And the last part is about the lung. The lung has many structures inside. You can see the sections of the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein, the bronchus, the bronchioles, the alveolar duct, the alveoli. But in this picture, you can see only the alveoli or air sacs. Each of these chambers represent one air sac. And you can see the capillary adjacent to these air sacs. Between the wall of the capillaries, you know that we have endothelium and the basement membrane, and the wall of our air sacs is a simple squamous epithelium with the basement membrane. These two together can make respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane should be thin enough to allow exchange of gases between alveoli and capillary. This is the other picture of the lung. In this picture, you can see alveoli or air sacs, and the wall of alveoli is composed of simple squamous epithelium. So this is about the gross and microscopic anatomy of respiratory system. See you later.